The executive in Australia. If you open the Constitution and try to understand it just by reading Chapter 2, you'll be in serious trouble. Because differently from the majority of the provisions about Parliament in Chapter 1 and about the judiciary in Chapter 3, the Australian executive is a mix of constitutional provisions and constitutional conventions. For example, there's no reference to either the Prime Minister or the Cabinet in the Australian Constitution, and they are still very important to the Australian executive. Hello everyone, my name is Renato Costa, this is AussieLaw Morning Edition, and today we'll look at the executive. What is and who is part of the executive branch in Australia? Let's take a look at the text of the Constitution and at some constitutional conventions. Hey, if you haven't done so, please leave a like in this video and also subscribe to our channel. And if you click the bell sign, you will be notified every time I upload a new video to this channel. This is a great way if you want to keep on learning more about public law in Australia. Now, let's turn to Chapter 2 of the Australian Constitution. Section 61 locates the source of the executive power in the Queen. Do you see that it says that the executive powers are vested in the Queen and are exercised by the Governor-General as the Queen's representative? So what are these powers? What are the functions of the executive? If we keep on reading this section, we will see that the main role of the executive is to execute and maintain the Constitution and the laws of the Commonwealth. So the federal executive is responsible for administering and applying the laws of the Commonwealth and the federal constitution. This is the primary function of the Australian executive in the Australian version of the separation of powers. I just wanted to highlight that here it is very clear the intention of the framers of the Australian Constitution to say that the federal executive was responsible to execute and maintain the laws of the Commonwealth, not the laws of the states. It was always their intention to maintain the independence of the states, so that the states could have their own governments, their own laws, and their own constitutions. If you want to know more about this relationship between the states and the Commonwealth, go and click on the top right corner and watch the playlist with all the videos about federalism in Australia. What you should also notice is that the content, the structure, the extent of the executive powers are not defined by Section 61 either. One of the things that we can see about the content, what this power is all about, is this distinction that I was highlighting before between the executive of the states and the executive of the Commonwealth. If you turn to Section 69 and 70, the last two sections of Chapter 2, you will notice how the framers tried to reallocate these powers that once belonged to the states and now are being transferred to the Commonwealth in the person of the Governor-General. So that's one thing. The other is that we can actually see that the powers are vested in the Queen, which brings us the idea that certain things that already existed throughout history in the common law and were exercised by the Crown in England were also carried and brought into Australia as part of these executive powers. In a case called Davis and Commonwealth from 1988, the High Court of Australia confirmed that view. They said that if you read carefully Section 61, you will notice that these executive powers that were vested in the Queen, they should also include those prerogative powers of the British Crown. However, these powers cannot include the powers that were reserved to the states and those that are precluded by the Constitution itself. So Section 61 doesn't tell us everything that we need to know about the content of the executive powers of the Federal Commonwealth. The fullness of the executive powers will not be in the text and structure of the Constitution, but will arise from constitutional conventions coming from history and from the development of common law. In another video, we'll talk specifically about what are these powers, and we can go over each type of executive power. But I'm not gonna do it now, and if you don't want to miss it, you already know what to do. That brings us to the structure of the executive, because just like the powers, the structure, the elements that compose the federal executive in Australia are not all laid out expressly in the text of the Constitution, but they exist since the beginning of the Federation in the form of constitutional conventions. Let's take a look at them. Section 61 talks about the Queen and the Governor-General. Section 62 about a thing called the Federal Executive Council. Section 63 talks about the Governor-General and the Federal Executive Council acting together, so the Governor in Council. Section 64 talks about the Ministers of State, and Section 67 about civil servants as other members of the executive government. But is that all? Are there any other elements that compose the Federal Executive in Australia? Yes, of course there are. As we saw, Section 61 vests the executive power in the Queen, but these powers are actually exercised by the Governor-General. However, according to our Constitutional Convention, the Governor-General will only act on the advice of elected ministers, ministers who are members of Parliament. That's the principle of responsible government. I've talked about it in the video that is appearing on your screen right now. If you haven't seen that, click there and watch that video as well. But who is this minister? You probably know that in Australia, the Governor-General will follow the advice of the Prime Minister. But there is no mention to the Prime Minister in the Australian Constitution. Conventions dictate that the Prime Minister is the leader of the party who has the majority in the House of Representatives. So, whereas the text of the Constitution says that the executive powers of the Commonwealth will be exercised by the Governor-General, we know that in practice and according to constitutional conventions, these powers will actually be exercised by the Prime Ministers and his or her ministers. Also, the Federal Executive Council in Section 62 is just another formal body that the Constitution refers to, because in fact, it only functions as a rubber stamp. As I mentioned in the video about the principle of responsible government, it's still theoretically possible for the Governor-General not to follow the advice of ministers. He or she would be exercising the reserve powers. But in reality, the Governor-General will follow the advice of ministers and the recommendation of the Federal Executive Council. And that's why the Constitution mentions the Governor in Council making the decisions. But the Federal Executive Council is not the Cabinet. The Cabinet is composed of the senior ministers of government. That's where the actual political decisions happen. And the decisions of the Cabinet will be transferred to the Federal Executive Council so that the Governor-General can act in Council. Finally, we do have the ministers. They are not only part of the executive of the government of the day, but they are also the heads of the many departments, the organs that function within the structure of the federal executive. These ministerial departments are the things that we actually see in our daily lives. These are departments like Department of Home Affairs, Defense, Education, Health, Social Services, and the list goes on. Each and every one of these departments is headed by a minister who takes responsibility individually for the good execution of that department and from the decisions that are made there. And with the other ministers of the cabinet, of the government, they will be collectively responsible for the maintenance and the execution of the Constitution and of the laws of the Commonwealth via the decisions and actions of the departments. I should also say that there are corporations and agencies that also compose the structure of the Australian Federal Executive. Examples of corporations can be the ABC and the Australian Post, and an agency, for example, is the Renewable Energy Agency. Oh, I cannot forget them, the people who actually make it happen, the civil servants. They are not elected, they are not directly chosen by the people, but they are the ones who you actually see and talk to and deal with in your daily life. Since they are moving the machinery of the state, they will be liable and responsible for their own actions internally. But ultimately, the minister that is the head of that department will be responsible for their actions before Parliament directly and indirectly before the whole of the electorate. Well, this was the Australian Executive 101. The basics about the elements, the composition and the structure of the Australian Executive according to the text of the Constitution and according to constitutional conventions. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and I will see you next time. Ciao!